I am excited to be able to introduce this great panel this morning. First, we have Marisa Hamsik, who brings nearly 20 years of experience working in climate finance, carbon markets, and sustainability with a focus on environmental markets and the energy transition. She is currently the General Manager of Strategy and Market Insights for Offsets and Emerging Technologies at Chevron New Energies, where she leads strategy and market intelligence. Marisa started her career at New Forests, an asset management startup investing in sustainable forestry and environmental assets in Australasia, as Director of Sustainability, Research, and Communications. Subsequent roles included Manager of Land Carbon Investments at BP Alternative Energy in London and Director of the Natural Climate Initiative at the Nature Conservancy. Marisa holds a BS in Journalism from Northwestern University and a Master of Environmental Management from the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Welcome, Marisa. Dan Hopper is the Director of Portfolio Planning and Analysis at Southern California Edison's Energy Procurement and Management Organization. In this role, he leads a team responsible for portfolio valuation, reporting, and analytics of SCE's $5 billion portfolio of energy resources. Previously, he led analysis and research on grid decarbonization, efficient electrification, and climate adaptation and resiliency that shaped SCE's Pathways 2045 corporate strategy and integrated resource plan. Dan has a diverse professional background in economic and electric systems analysis, decarbonization strategy, and energy policy development. He earned a BS in electrical engineering from the University of Nevada, Reno, a master's in economics from California University, Fullerton, and an MBA from right here at UCLA Anderson. Welcome, Dan. And we have another UCLA affiliate. We have Camly Tran, who's the head of operations at CarbonBuilt, an ultra-low carbon concrete startup. She manages the strategic programming and corporate and carbon operations for them. Prior to joining, she served as the executive director of the Institute for Carbon Management at UCLA, which is a translation institute hosted by the School of Engineering. ICM supports the development of pilots and prototypes for carbon management technologies, and CarbonBuilt is the first technology to have spun out of ICM. She received her BS and PhD in chemistry from Carnegie Mellon and Brown University, respectively. So please give a warm welcome to our panel this morning. So we're focused on decarbonization today. And in 2015, the Paris Agreement laid out goals to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Recently, the UN has stated that to actually meet those goals, emissions will need to be reduced by 45% by 2030. This is a huge goal and something that governments alone cannot be left to do themselves. It requires real transformative change in how businesses operate. And many businesses have committed to achieving these goals. So I want to start by asking each of you, can you provide just a general background on how your organization is approaching decarbonization? Is this something you're concerned is going to limit your business or an opportunity for expansion and growth? You want to start?
I can start, yes. So first, thank you to UCLA Anderson for inviting me back to be on this panel. Always love coming back. I'm glad they always have this, continue to have this conference to help support leaders in climate change mitigation and build a community here. Just short, really quick, at Southern California Edison, decarbonization is really ingrained in our strategy, and it has been over the last several years. And I'd say, we did some work in 2016 initially to sort of map out sort of what the state needed to do to reach our 2030 goals. Not coincidentally, a lot of folks are seeing, similar results in the analysis they did. Clean power, electrification, are really needed for reaching the decarbonization objectives kind of in the near term. Low carbon fuels, sequestration, other technologies are going to be needed in the longer term. Really built into our DNA because it provides a significant opportunity for electric utility, electric power providers in general, because when you think about sort of the need to support kind of a clean, resilient, reliable grid, that's really central, right, to reaching our near and longer term goals. And so we're supporting that through various types of investments, not only in the grid, but in enabling technologies like electric vehicle charging stations, clean resources, energy storage, as well as trying to identify ways to not only meet our carbon objectives or clean energy objectives, but think about how to mitigate climate risk and climate change as it happens as well. So significant opportunities for electric companies and infrastructure providers, but also significant opportunities for new technologies and companies supporting sort of decarbonized end uses and decarbonized fuels. So we think all around a lot of opportunities for commercial enterprises to really drive the transition going forward.
Thanks. So hi everyone. Great to be here today. Thanks for the opportunity. So at Chevron, decarbonization and making progress on the energy transition is really our license to operate. It's something we have to do. Shareholders and stakeholders are demanding it. So in 2021, Chevron set its first net zero target. So a target to be net zero in our upstream operations for scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2050. So yes, that is only a subset of our emissions profile, but that's where we are in the start of our journey. And in addition to that, we also have what we call a portfolio carbon intensity target by 2028, so a much nearer term target of reducing the carbon intensity of our emissions, so it's not an absolute target, by 2028 and putting us on a trajectory for decarbonization and eventual net zero in the future. And also in setting those targets, to your question about is it an opportunity, at the same time, Chevron launched Chevron New Energies, which is the business division that I'm in. And the division was created to explore business opportunities for meeting Chevron's own decarbonization objectives and for producing ever cleaner, ever lower carbon, ever more resilient, more affordable, and safer products. But also to figure out how to offer those products and services to third parties. So build new businesses for the future. And so what Chevron New Energies focuses on is 4 areas: carbon capture, utilization, and storage, hydrogen value chains, offsets, and emerging lower carbon power technologies with an initial focus on geothermal. So I sit in the offsets and emerging technologies business, and I can talk more about exactly what that means over time. But the goal is, as we build businesses, as we build operational capacity, understanding of economics, technical feasibility around carbon capture, hydrogen, offsets, and emerging technologies, that we can apply that to our base business to meet our decarbonization goals and move toward that net zero future, as well as being able to offer those services and capabilities to our customers and to others to transition the energy sector more broadly and the industrial and particularly hard to abate sectors.
Great. Well, thanks also for the invitation. I would say CarbonBuilt was founded to really help decarbonize the concrete and cement sector, and we can categorize that as a hard to abate sector. And what we found was that to do that, you have to really convince this very conservative field to make a product that really needs to perform and meet certain standards to be in the construction space. And so CarbonBuilt has really focused on producing the same product that performs the same but has no difference in cost or operation change. So it's really a built-in or integratable technology to an existing field. And so that's one way, with the support of a partnership between a startup like ours and an existing concrete producer, that we've been able to help decarbonize slowly those plants one by one. In the US, there's 800 concrete block plants. And what I'll get into later is the cement and concrete industries contribute roughly between 8 to 10% of the global CO2 emissions. So it's a huge space that we're working to decarbonize, and we're just one of several other startups in this space.
And just one of the things about Cleantech, I think, is there are always a lot of definitional issues. People use terms interchangeably. So I want to clarify 2 terms first. The difference between cement and concrete. You can tell us that.
Sure. So I'm guilty of it too. I think many people use cement and concrete interchangeably. Cement is actually the binder or the glue that holds together the aggregates or sand and gravel together, which form, once reacted with water, concrete. So concrete is either the ready-mix slurry that you see on the sidewalk, or prefabricated products like concrete blocks, pavers, rods. So cement itself, actually, the production of cement is the main kind of emitter in this industry. And so even if we transition to renewable energy sources to produce cement intrinsically and chemically releases CO2 upon its production. And that's actually 60% of the CO2 emissions that come from cement. And so what CarbonBuilt tries to do in our concrete mix design formulations is replace cement or reduce cement significantly with other alternative binders that can react and form the same kind of glue properties as you will with a traditional cement.
And then the other definition that I wanted to clarify is we're talking about decarbonization here, but as we know, global warming is due to more than just carbon. So particularly Chevron and SCE, you guys, when you're talking about decarbonization, you're actually talking about all of the global warming gases, right? Or are you talking about carbon only?
It's all of the global warming gases, carbon being the primary contributor. Just because in the electric sector, it's because of combustion, and so it's carbon that's being emitted. And we should also talk about that it's not just carbon emissions, but it's also local air emissions that we're trying to mitigate through a lot of these strategies as well.
And for Chevron, another major contributor is methane. And so we have a completely separate methane strategy to reduce venting and reduce flaring, which are sort of normal operational practices in oil and gas operations, but one of the lowest hanging fruits in terms of acting on climate. So yeah, when we say decarbonization, we mean all the greenhouse gases.
And Marisa, given your background, can you kind of give us a primer on carbon markets and who the players are and just the basics for people who aren't quite as familiar?
How much time do we have? Yeah, I mean, carbon market. Yeah, so I've been around carbon markets since they really started back in 2004, 2005. And I wish I could say they have matured to a point where there's a lot of fungibility and we have a price on carbon and it's just part of our economic system to price carbon and transact it like we would transact any other commodity. That's not where we are. But when I think about carbon markets, there's like a patchwork, a handful of things. There's compliance carbon markets. So right here in California, we have one of the world's largest cap and trade markets, and offsets are actually a large component that the California Air Resources Board permits emitters and covered entities like Chevron to use offsets for a very small proportion of our compliance obligations here in California. And there's lots of jurisdictions around the world. The EU has the largest carbon market, but even developing countries have carbon markets as well, and also use carbon taxes and use various combinations of cap and trade, baseline and credit, offsets, various combinations that are all seeking to do the same thing around putting a price on carbon and allowing entities that must reduce their carbon intensity various mechanisms to do that at least cost. Then you have the whole world of the voluntary carbon market, which I'm guessing is more maybe where questions might come up, which is the world in which corporates or individuals or anyone makes a voluntary commitment to reduce emissions and voluntarily chooses to purchase offsets from another entity that has voluntarily chosen to reduce their emissions or to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and get those activities certified through various standards in a way that produces something that's a fungible credit that we call an offset. And there's a number of different standards, market-leading standards. There's 4 that Chevron work with, but there's really one dominant one called VERA, or the Verified Carbon Standard, that is essentially a multi-stakeholder, bottoms-up organization that has developed methodologies for various different project types, whether it's protecting forests, restoration, clean cook stoves, renewable energy. And if you are someone who is taking on those activities and reducing emissions, you can use these standards, this VERA standard, to verify and validate your emissions reductions and go through a very long, complicated process to eventually issue something called a carbon offset that we as a buyer will then recognize and say, okay, that project has been verified and validated to the VERA standard. We trust that standard for various reasons. We will pay you, we will buy those credits, or we will invest in your project up front and you will repay us in credits. It's a complicated space that's undergoing a lot of upheaval. It had a massive year in 2021, 2022, and has since sort of crashed for various reasons. And that is not the first time I've seen it over the last 20 years. So happy to go further down that rabbit hole, but that's a quick overview.
Yeah, and I think we'll get a little more into offsets in a bit. But first, Dan, I want to ask you about SCE's transition plan and their Pathways 2045. If you could tell us a little bit about where you're going with that.
Absolutely. So, like I mentioned earlier, a few years ago, we embarked on a journey to kind of rethink and reimagine sort of the role of the utility, especially California utility, in this space of decarbonization and a state that has pretty significant and stringent carbon goals, as well as sort of a customer base that really wants us to decarbonize. And so we invested a significant amount of work internally to sort of do economy-wide GHG emissions modeling to determine sort of the least cost set of pathways in order to reach carbon neutrality by 2045. Well, by the way, along the way, hitting some of our 2030 targets as a state, 80-32 is in statute, the 40 by 30 goal. And a lot of it, it was a significant amount of work that involved sort of, end-to-end modeling across the organization with the outcome that said, well, look, if we're talking about what are the most viable and least cost ways to reach our GHG targets, we need to really start with clean energy, right? Decarbonizing the electric sector as quickly as possible, while not sacrificing affordability for our customers, obviously. And while we do that, the next step is then to sort of figure out how much of the economy-wide load can we put on end uses can we then power from the electric sector through efficient electrification. The most significant amount of GHG emissions in California come from transportation, electric vehicles, and zero-emission vehicles being a very significant measure in reaching those net zero targets. And so doing a lot of modeling to figure out, okay, what is a reasonable amount of adoption for these vehicles? How does the electric sector then power and support all of this electrification? What sort of investments in the grid do we need? Buildings was another measure as well. So, looked at electrifying buildings as being another way through heat pumps of space and water heating, and other types of end uses being a critical kind of measure as well. And so when we look at sort of the halfway point or the near-term point of 2030, we saw that about at least 8 million vehicles needed to be electrified or at least zero emissions to meet the 2030 goals, as well as 30% of buildings powered through space and water heating through heat pumps, 80% clean energy throughout the sector. Pause there. Advocate hard to sort of, to the policymakers to sort of pass policies to support these changes, then look past to 2045 and say, okay, well, what else needs to happen? Because we have a CARB scoping plan that's looking at some of this, but we wanted to do a deep dive to say, what does that mean for our sector? What does that mean for the other sectors? And no surprise, you sort of carry forward that same trajectory of zero emission transportation, deep decarbonization on the electric sector. Most of the buildings end uses are electrified as well, but then this is where we bring in a lot of low carbon fuels for the remaining combustion in the system for hard to electrify sectors. You have some sequestration in there because you can't zero out everything. Now we're embarking on some work to say, okay, once we pass 2030, we really need to start thinking about grid reliability, grid resiliency. Climate change is actually still happening on top of all of this. And so how do we think about not only meeting our long-term decarbonization goals, but how do we do it in a way that invests in climate resiliency as well? And so, we'll start, having more and more sort of discussions about sort of integrating those views and determining sort of what policies need to support both that supportive carbon management, but also climate resiliency on the electric sector and the other sectors as well.
And so what I'm hearing out of this also is that this is not something you can do alone as SE. Right. You need partnerships, you need collaboration. Yeah. And in regulatory entities or partially regulated ones, I think there is a lot of avenues where you can look to partner with perhaps something like a low carbon concrete manufacturer to deal with facilities. So to what extent do you see developing those pathways for partnership as key to actually moving forward and meeting those goals?
Yeah, so I think they're huge, right? You're right. Infrastructure providers can't do it alone, so it's both partnerships with other infrastructure providers, not only the electric sector, but also sort of the large transportation sort of organizations in cities and municipalities. What about the gas system, and how do we help to support sort of our shared sort of transition across through the space? But yes, also so end uses, partnering with electric vehicle manufacturers, partnering with new technologies manufacturers significantly around like long duration energy storage, for example. How do we sort of co-develop these new technologies in a way that by the time we need them, in the next 5-10 years, they're commercially viable. So there's a lot of work currently going on in that space. I think we're going to talk about some of the federal policies that are happening and some of the available funding which is critical to helping to enable some of those partnerships going forward.
And that's a great answer for that side. And I also want to ask, kind of on the private side, new technology can be a competitive edge for you, but it also sharing that may be critical to actually achieving these goals. So from both the startup side and the very established company side, how do you balance those two incentives?
I know from our perspective, it's the same exact sentiment that partnerships are key. It's actually sort of a founding principle of Chevron New Energies as progress through partnerships. Whereas in our traditional business, we're good at drilling wells and doing all the things that an oil and gas company does. But in the energy transition space, there's competitive advantages that we have by being a large engineering company and things that we can implement, being comfortable with long-term risk. We obviously have a strong balance sheet, but on a lot of the new technologies that are going to be required to achieve the decarbonization and the kinds of engineered systems that will be needed, we don't have that expertise. And certainly in the offset space, we're not going out and developing offset projects. We're partnering with companies that know how to do that and financing a lot of that activity. In the more engineering side, we do, like for example, in our carbon capture and storage business, we know that we're good at storing carbon. We understand a lot about the subsurface and how to get carbon back underground in reservoirs and other areas that maybe we have taken hydrocarbons out of. We understand a bit about transportation, about how do you move carbon around from industrial facilities to where those capture facilities might be, but we don't know much about capturing the capture components. We can do the storage and the transportation, but not the capture. And so for that, what is the right model? Are you a corporate venture capital partner in some of these companies? And if so, where is that firewall between then getting to apply that technology in Chevron versus that startup actually being successful and selling that technology to many others as well? And that's usually how we think about it, our corporate venture capital activity, where we might take a minority seat on a board and really bring everything that we can and all of our engineering expertise to bear on the success of that company. But then whether we are a buyer of that technology is sort of a firewall between the teams that would be negotiating that so that that company can also grow in its own right.
And I guess from the startup side, this is your competitive edge. So how do you work on diffusing this through companies?
Right. I think CarbonBuilt's whole business is dependent on partnerships with existing concrete producers. And so without having concrete producers willing to work with us, we can't actually transform the way concrete is being produced. And so our partnerships expand not only with the concrete side, but with financial partners to help do project finance, because each line retrofit ranges between $1 to $2 million in CapEx. And when your very conservative construction partner is not willing to upfront that cash, we have to come up with creative solutions of how to do that. And then also partnerships for buyers who want to purchase our offsets that's generated through our carbon credit generation process. I think we are very much looking forward to the expansion of support from the federal government with the IRA, FOAs that just came out, and then also transitioning to using more renewable energy to energize the equipment that's required to actually produce the concrete. And right now, one of our sources for CO2 is using biomass waste to generate the CO2. And the biomass system that we use runs completely on electricity, and we get that electricity from a solar-powered grid. So we are working on trying to transform using lower carbon energy sources throughout our process as well.
And I think we'll jump ahead a little bit since you just mentioned, we've brought the IRA up a few times, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in 2022. And to what extent do you think this is going to transform both your businesses and the industry? So do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the, if not the largest government support for decarbonization. And so companies like ours, we are able to show that there is a demand for these low carbon products. And now we actually have the financial support to generate those low carbon products. And it pushes kind of the suppliers to enable product development when venture capital might not want to invest in commercialization of ideas that are early stage. And so I will say with the two recent FOAs that came out, the minimum proposal amount of dollar funding is $35 million. And to a startup like ours, that's huge. That can convert 20 plus concrete lines. And so while these grants are very competitive, I think they're crucial for supporting companies of our size to actually scale and do proof that these products can be generated and sold in the market as is, really without any difference to price, performance, or operations for the concrete producer.
Yeah. From our side, I mean, the IRA mostly comes into play for us in our CCUS business. The reality is that in the Paris Agreement, but in the IPCC report, so the scientific report that supports the whole UN process, it was very clear the role that removals are going to need to play to meet net zero ambitions. But financing that is really expensive. CCUS, whether it's point source, so capturing the emissions from power generation, let's say, or from a concrete or cement facility, I'm not sure anymore, but from industrial carbon capture and storage is extremely expensive. And then direct air capture, which maybe some of you have heard about, of essentially building big machines that suck CO2 out of the air. It sounds like science fiction, but there's plenty of companies trying to figure it out. But these things are $300, $400, $500, $600 a ton. And so the IRA was a huge boon to our CCUS business, and particularly in how we think about DAC. But the DAC credits which are tax equity credits, so there's a whole sort of mechanism around that, but it's only $185 a ton for DAC specifically, and I think $135 for point source capture. That only actually gets us about half the way there. So you still have to figure out the economics around who is going to pay for that additional capture. How do we split that with our partners? Where is the value add? Where's the value generation and revenue generation for us? Because unfortunately, for a company, of our size and scale, we have lots of choices of what to do with our capital, and to convince our executives and to convince our board that this is the direction of travel, that we want to place capital in these new kinds of technologies, we do have to show competitive returns. And so the IRA goes part of the way there and is giving us a lot to think about, and it's sort of the public sector saying, all right, here's what we're going to offer. And now the private sector has to figure out what it can bring to the table as well to advance some of these solutions.
So I think the IRA hopefully is transformative. I mean, I think back a few years ago, we were heavy advocates in the Build Back Better sort of process, which I think eventually became a lot of the IRA. During that period, we wrote a thought piece entitled "Mind the Gap," where it was like, hey, here's what the state, we're looking at California, needs to do to reach our 2030 goals, and we're not on the trajectory. We're still not really on the trajectory to meeting those goals. And then it laid out a variety of policy proposals to help support that transition. It's good to see a lot of those got into IRA. So more, stable and longer EV tax credits, incentives and tax credits for heat pumps, standalone energy storage tax credits, et cetera. And so, a lot of those are great movements and will help to sort of, fund this transition to adopting these technologies. Not quite, it goes far enough to reaching the goals, but I think it does a lot. I think there still is somewhat of a gap here in the way that the IRA, and I'm looking mostly at, I'll talk about like customer adoption, right? We're trying to incentivize customer adoption for a lot of these technologies. And so if we're talking about equity, we're talking about accessibility to clean energy. If you don't have tax liability, you're not going to be incentivized to adopt some of these technologies. And so there's probably a need to sort of think about other types of mechanisms. California is doing some things. But if we're going to get broad-based sort of transitions, then we're going to need to go farther than just sort of tax credits and figure out sort of more sustainable ways to sort of transition the rest of the economy as well. It is interesting and good to see some of the incentives around sort of green hydrogen and sequestration, but also agree that it's not clear how effective some of those policies are going to be, but it's a good start.
And so going off that, if we were looking for what the next IRA includes, like what would we be most excited to see to further incentivize the transition?
Well, I think even more of what we see, and I think a lot of the things that were in the original package fell off. But maybe we have direct grants or incentives, cash payments to people, to households, to help sort of adopt some of these clean technologies, right? If again, if you don't have the tax liability, you're not going to incentivize the transition. There's probably a need to sort of look at sort of a broad-based kind of other technologies. There was a small carve out for nuclear in there, and I think if we're talking about carbon-free, let's think about all technologies that are going to help us get there. So maybe there's more of a focus in some of those emerging technologies as well.
Yeah, I mean, the clearest answer is, a price on carbon, right? That would drive incentives in ways that don't require all of these kind of arcane, grant programs and different kinds of public incentives. If and when there could be a price on carbon, that will incentivize the private sector to behave in ways that are very different and drive the economics that require the investments that are needed. But short of that, yeah, I think, I also cover the offsets and the emerging technology space. And as has been mentioned a couple times, we are specifically looking at geothermal, but also delving into small modular nuclear, long duration storage, and a few other areas. And so things that are considering, moving on from kind of solar and wind and non-intermittent baseload power, but other ways to provide baseload power that can help electrify all of the systems we need to electrify would be interesting.
Yeah, maybe just to add to both of these points, for us, federal support for state programs for procurement of low carbon materials and building materials.
Yeah, that would be great. And you mentioned offsets again, and I want to make sure we leave plenty of time to talk about offsets because these are the touchstone of decarbonization. Marisa, do you want to start by talking a little bit about the general state of offsets and as a purchaser of them, what you look for in a high quality offset?
Yeah, it's a funny one, right? Because the criticism that oil and gas companies, but many companies get, is that somehow by thinking about offsets and utilizing offsets, we're taking our eye off the ball or using it as like sort of a cheap way to get out of our decarbonization obligations. That is certainly not how Chevron looks at it. Can't really say I know any company that looks at it in that way. Our shareholders and our stakeholders would not stand for, it's not a legitimate use of offsets to sort of have an offset forward strategy. So we try to think about offsets as within a diversified portfolio of things that we are trying to do to reach our decarbonization and eventual net zero objectives. And in doing that, what we're doing in Chevron New Energies is investing in a portfolio of high quality offset projects that can deliver credits from next year to mid-century. So these are long-term investments, and as you mentioned, high quality is the name of the game, and that's really the challenge of what's happening in markets right now. The standards that I mentioned before have been around now for about 15 years, and they've been through many iterations of companies and practitioners, and certainly the academic community, commenting on them not being rigorous enough, that the project that is providing offsets to the market is not delivering genuine climate action. And so those standards are continually trying to improve, fix problems where they exist, and to help buyers have confidence in the credits that are being issued. What has happened in the last kind of 6 months, and I don't think it's going to slow down, are some very high-profile media articles that have been incredibly critical of either very specific projects and then made large assumptions about what that means for the market as a whole, or a very influential article that looked at an entire project type that we call avoided deforestation, so basically forest conservation, and really accused the entire project type of being a little bit of a scam, which is kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and I won't sort of go down that conversation. But what it has done to buyers is really confuse the market somewhat on, if we can't trust these standards, what can we trust? How do we define quality? Do we have to do that at a company level? If we're going to do that as an industry level, what does that look like? And there's a lot of solutions that are being proposed at a market level right now. So a market standard for quality, which is expected to be released next quarter. I have a lot of questions about whether that is whether a market standard applying to all project types in all geographies is actually going to give buyers what we need to feel confident in what we're buying. And so what we're having to do is really develop in-house expertise and a lot of deep technical expertise in cook stoves, in forestry, in renewables, and apply a company-wide standard to the kinds of offsets we will and won't invest in, and do a lot of project-level due diligence.
And as a regulated entity, do you have additional standards that you have to comply with when you're looking at offsets, or are these, you kind of use your internal strategy goals to guide them?
It's similar, so as a we don't participate in the offset market. In California, obviously, we have that ability, but we do not. I think I don't have much to add to what Marisa said, but I think in general, it's an all of the above sort of approach we need to take for carbon management. And there is a space, especially for hard to transition sectors, like this can't happen overnight, right? And so we need tools like offsets, high quality offsets, in order to enable sort of efficient transition in a lot of these sectors. And standards are critical here, right? We need to make sure that all the additionality issue, right, is there. They have to be more than what would have happened otherwise. They have to be permanent, right? So there has to be these ongoing standards that people can trust and bank on in place in order for this to be effective. And I know, by the way, there needs to be some sort of binding carbon target, right, to push companies to really sort of invest in this space in order to make it viable.
And just kind of picking up on that, do you think the offset approach should be different in really hard to decarbonize industries like the energy and the concrete industry versus, say, tech, something that might be easier to pull the carbon out of your operations?
I mean, it's sort of what's happening. I don't know if we want to, touch on the whole SBTI world, Science-Based Target Initiative world. But there is a world and a market leader really pushing and advocating for very stringent net zero targets without the use of offsets, with the exception of removals for residual emissions in the net zero year, which is like 2050. That's a very different vision than in hard to abate sectors, where we fully expect to use high quality offsets as part of our achievement of net zero. Those are two very different sort of visions of the future. And I think that's part of what we've seen in the carbon markets in the past 6 months, is a little bit of a buyer retraction, where buyers aren't sure. Are they going to get accused of greenwashing if they continue on their strategy of offset use in a diversified portfolio of solutions? And if they are, is it worth it? Or can they push their technical abatement further? But the reality is, I guess there's kind of two realities that are important with offsets. One is that, of course, it would be great to just do technical abatement. But if we knew how to do that from an engineering perspective and from a cost perspective, we'd be doing it. But without the incentive of a price on carbon, a lot of the solutions that we would have to implement would drive up the price of our products and services so much that they would be uneconomic. And that has major, economic implications to all the products and services that you buy in, the global economy. You can only sort of push decarbonization so far before you start to really erode the value proposition, and your shareholders, quite frankly, aren't going to want to go down that route. But the other really important piece, and I try to talk about this a lot with people who fundamentally don't think offsets should be part of the solution, is that the science is very clear that to achieve net zero by mid-century, we also need to conserve our forests and restore our degraded lands and improve our farming practices. And a great way to finance that is private sector capital through offset markets. Without that, it's unclear to me that the public sector is going to be able to finance all those activities on its own.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think what we run into a lot is CarbonBuilt generates both carbon avoidance credits and carbon removal credits. Carbon avoidance credits come from the material substitution that we use to replace cement. So in theory, we reduce this CO2 emissions that would have otherwise been emitted through cement production. So that is a carbon avoidance credit. Carbon removal credit is when we actually take CO2, gaseous form, mineralize that as now a solid carbonate or limestone species that's trapped in concrete. So that's what we consider a carbon removal credit that's generated. I think in the space what we're seeing is there are many people who are disinterested in the carbon avoidance side, but and carbon avoidance could also come from using CO2 from a point source like flue gas, but that's happening now. So if we're not able to capitalize using CO2 that's already being emitted and just changing the pathway of where that's getting stored and used, for us, it's kind of not moving the needle forward. We're not able to do a removal until we actually get to zero first. And so for us, I think we view carbon offsets as both an and solution to carbon reduction. To Marisa's point, the technologies that are focused on removing CO2 from the atmosphere, these direct air captures, are very expensive. They're still early stage. And after you capture the CO2, most of it is being sequestered underground. And we still don't understand long-term risk associated with that. In theory, we have enough space to capture 10 billion tons of CO2, but we don't know at that scale what that could do. And so companies like ours, while our removal profile is nowhere near that, I mean, it offers an option to both avoid CO2 that would have otherwise been emitted and actually start to store and sequester CO2 at small scale.
And with that, I think we will open up to questions for now. I have a few ones I want to finish with you guys, but for the audience to start, do we have a microphone? Perfect.
Hi there, I'm Iwan. I'm an alum. Thanks first and foremost for what you've covered. My question is around adoption and maybe a little bit of a follow-up of how do we accelerate this with a sense that net zero is not enough and that we actually need to be net negative and begin drawing down. You mentioned that, hey, we're not even on a path to net zero, which sometimes feels daunting. I said, my question is, if you could wave a magic wand and unleash 2 or 3 drivers of faster adoption in your areas, what would those be?
Good question. So I think faster adoption, it's tough, but I think it's at some level there is a sense that maybe the portfolio, and I kind of hinted at it before, maybe the portfolio of incentives isn't enough to drive people to adopt. And I'll just use electric vehicles as an example. It's all the models say, hey, by 2024 we're going to reach parity on the price, but is that enough to get over the psychological sort of barriers to adoption? How do we get renters to adopt when we can't install charging stations in their homes? What about apartments, et cetera? So there's I think a very significant infrastructure play that helps to do that, and there's probably just money that helps to do that as well, to support sort of they see, it's a kind of a demand pull sort of policy where you see the demand coming in and then vehicle manufacturers start pumping these things out at a greater clip. So I think that, the funding out there, while increased, probably isn't enough to accelerate. I think the other piece of it is, when we think about the electric power sector, it's sort of it's a difficult question to answer, but we might have the goals in place. We have SB 100, 100% clean by 2045, but there are barriers in place that we're not quite addressing yet. Land use constraints. How do we get transmission built faster? You have environmentalists fighting each other, because of land use, and others want climate change to be mitigated. And so what's the right answer for that? It's a tough question because there's a lot of local opposition to that as well. And so maybe the magic wand isn't for it to happen, but for at least the conversation and the policymakers to sort of have a plan around some of these things, on the ground implementation. Certain regulations aren't quite sufficient. CEQA and other things kind of, need to be there, but they're going to slow down development of large infrastructure that's going to be needed. And so I think very significant and proactive addressing of all of these different barriers that are going to actually get in front of adoption. It would be really at the top of the list, and things that we've been really advocating for, at least in our enterprise.
Yeah, from my perspective, I said it before. I think the magic wand is a price on carbon, which is it's not going to fall out of the sky. We've been trying for years, but the reality is that we can go build a CCUS business because we're good at building things and we understand the engineering. We can build hydrogen value chains. We can build geothermal facilities. But the demand creation on the other side of who's really going to buy these products at scale and what is their incentive to do so is a little bit of the missing piece right now. And where that becomes really challenging is at the shareholder level, where we can go and build a new energies business and we have a mandate to do that. But we also need to demonstrate that we can deliver attractive returns and shareholder value that can compete with our traditional base business. And until we can demonstrate that, because we have clear line of sight to demand at scale and the revenue generation from that, it's hard to to shift that amount of capital. So then the question becomes, well, what would incentivize those customers to buy CCUS or to transition to hydrogen? And if it's not a price on carbon or pressure for them to decarbonize that comes really through regulation, I don't think this comes from voluntary commitments to address climate change. I don't think that can deliver the speed that you talked about. So it's hard to pass the buck and say, well, it's back to regulation. But really this, all climate is just a public good problem of just an externality. And that's sort of what the government is there to do, is to help internalize these externalities. Otherwise, the private sector is just going to behave as it always does. And if there's no cost to putting carbon into the atmosphere, then there's no incentive to change that.
Yeah, I mean, for us, the concrete sector is a super conservative sector. They've been operating the same way for hundreds of years. There's really no incentive for them to change how they've been producing concrete. And so for us, I think creating the demand side, when end users are saying they will not build new construction projects without a low carbon concrete product, it's much harder to force a concrete producer to change. And so I think our strategy is to focus both on kind of the front end, where you have trying to convince concrete producers that not only is this socially a good thing to do, but you can still become profitable. And on the end user side, encouraging real estate developers, architects, individuals to demand that these products exist, and that will then force the concrete producers to be willing to have that conversation and then find solutions that can, again, be integrated into the existing processes.
Thank you very much. My name is Keith Kaplan. I've been involved with UCLA Anderson for years, and I really appreciate your expertise. Just wonderful and very insightful. I asked this question because what I'm hearing is a consensus that we have a geopolitical and a world business issue to price carbon, and that offset is what will fuel the different technologies, from the different fusion technologies that have become stable to the different carbon capture and the various different types of infrastructure projects that are happening. Would that summarize what we're really talking about here? Is how do we have industry put a price on funding as a public-private partnership globally?
I guess that's what Paris is, kind of trying to achieve, or not just Paris, but the UNFCCC. And it's easy to pass the buck back to governments and say, if only governments did this, then the incentives would work. The reality is that, those governments are influenced by a lot of our industries, who, maybe might not be always the most progressive advocates for climate change. So some of it is government. I will say some of it also is shareholders and activist shareholders that can push the envelope on what they expect from these public companies, in terms of climate action. And, we've seen some of that with Exxon and with Shell, activist shareholders forcing climate advocates onto their boards and forcing, actually the courts, in the case of the Dutch courts, forcing Shell to accept a 2030 or 2040 climate target, which is pretty fascinating. There is some of that shareholder sentiment as well, but as we know, shareholders tend to be, very short-term in nature. And so to have an activist shareholder who's providing patient capital and allowing these new energies to develop and not sort of demanding those quarterly returns from traditional businesses are probably not the dominant kind of shareholder out there.
I guess I have a bit of a different view. I mean, I think a carbon price would be helpful, but not sufficient. The reason why I say that is because I don't think we have, I think it's largely shown that in order for a carbon price to be effective, we really need a political establishment that's willing to sort of, deal with the implications of that sort of carbon price. And I'm just not sure that we actually have that, because you need, not only the price, but you also need a reduction in the quantity of emissions, firm reduction in quantity of emissions in a sector, and that's really what's going to drive the shortage price, or the marginal price of carbon. And I'm just not sure we have the the political will necessarily to make that happen in a way that helps us to hit net zero, and the 1.5 degree C targets in time. So it's part of the solution. I think it's helpful because it provides significant amount of, in California, AB 32, the cap and trade program provides significant funding for a lot of the decarbonization efforts we have. It does help to manage some of the emissions throughout the sector, but you need a portfolio of things, not just the price. You need the government to come in and step in to manage the public good, and to provide incentives, to provide programs, to do things in a way that work together with a price to cooperatively help to meet the targets themselves.
Yeah, I agree with Dan here. I think so much of what small businesses and startups rely on is support from both the public and private side in terms of funding. And I think with the IRA, that's certainly motivating companies like ours to be excited and that there's a path forward. But those proposals are also very competitive, and everyone is going for it. It's a lot of work to go after. They just released a DAC hub proposal, direct air capture hub proposal, where companies like ours that can use CO2 to create a product could tap into. But again, you're thinking, 10 years from now at billion-dollar scale, and we just can't actually wait for those solutions to be available. So in addition to kind of the partnership with the public support, we do need private industry partners to help kind of push the decarbonization path forward.
Thank you.
My name is Gladys Bustos. I work in green byproducts, solutions in water, energy, technology, biofuels, aviation fuel from plant-based. I have a 900-home development in Southern California that I'm working on, and I'm looking at why is it that we're not working harder at renewable, sustainable communities as the method to catapult what we're discussing at this point.
Are you asking why we're not targeting communities?
Renewable, sustainable communities. Why isn't that a focus even today? We've heard about it years ago, but I don't see anybody working in that.
I think for us as a supplier, we'd love to provide the products. Yeah, we'd love to provide the products for that. For where CarbonBuilt's kind of pathway ends is we help the producers produce the product. We don't actually help them then find buyers, but as we'd love to talk to you about that. That would be a great story for us.
I can bring the cement from Mexico if you want.
So part of our strategy too is to use kind of local and regional materials to reduce the transportation CO2 costs there. But
if you're fighting an uphill fight, then you got to go where you got to go.
Right.
And we are actually, I think maybe do we have time for one more question on that? Yeah, I have one question that I think may be useful to a lot of our audience. This is a really exciting industry, and people kind of seem to come from all sorts of backgrounds to get into it. What would be your advice for an MBA student looking to break into the clean tech industry?
Okay, I could start. Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say, and I went through that same process, right? So I kind of a career switch. I was an aerospace engineer and wanted to move into energy, clean energy. I think the first thing was I was very interested in sustainability, so just kind of maintain that interest, learn a lot, get passionate about it. But then the first thing I'd say, play to your strengths at some level. So I wanted to pivot into something I could use my engineering background to help sort of support. So maybe it is clean energy directly, maybe it's transportation, something that's sort of adjacent to something that you've learned is sort of at least was helpful for me. But don't be too kind of stringent on that. It's good to explore, take a little bit of risk and move, and do different things that could be interesting. And don't spend too much time doing that, though. It's sort of like specialized, get to develop a specialization in something kind of fairly quickly. And then the other thing is at UCLA especially, you have a pretty good alumni network. So there are people doing interesting things, not just in the business school, but other schools. So figure out ways to sort of buy someone coffee, buy someone a drink, talk about their path, talk about what they do. Talking to people, get away from the computer and phone when you do your research, and actually talking and interviewing with people, I thought was very helpful for me in actually kind of figuring out what I wanted to do.
Yeah, not too much more to add to that other than, making sure that if this specialization, whatever it ends up being, energy transition, sustainable buildings, et cetera, is your passion, making sure that whenever you are interviewing, informational or otherwise, that you're really clear on what the company does in that space and how your skill set and your excitement and your enthusiasm fits what that company is doing, and isn't just sort of generic business skills, because obviously that's something that can be provided by a lot of different people. So, do your homework, have as many conversations as you can, and I guess a little bit different than the specialization comment. I've seen people succeed who have actually pivoted a lot of times, but in the narrow window of kind of sustainability or environmental engineering or the energy transition, but actually know a little bit about a lot of different aspects, the policy aspects, the engineering aspects, the legal aspects, even not becoming a lawyer, but understanding how to engage with that world and kind of making yourself a little bit jack of all trades. That's a very valuable skill set to companies that are trying to deal with these really complex problems that often require multidisciplinary solutions.
Yeah, I would say just find companies or organizations that you're really passionate about, reach out and have conversations. For us, I think over half of, we're a team of 15, so that's not very big, but over half of our employees are opportunistic hires. We've met them, we thought they had a great skill set or a great passion, and we found a position, we built a position around them. So if you are, searching JDs and there's nothing that really is fitting, still reach out to them, meet them. More often than not, there might be a role for you in that company.
And I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. Your insight has been great.